What does the Oracle Pythia say about why we never returned to the moon since 1972? After the space race of the 1960s and the conquest of our satellite in 1969, no one went back since then. Why? The costs, the priorities, the Russians, the Chinese, and of course, other theories. On December 14, 1972, the Apollo 17 space mission left the surface of the moon and began its journey back to Earth. Astronaut Eugene Cernan, by entering the moon landing and closing the door, became the last man to set foot on another planet. His journey was the last in a series of epic space missions that brought man from the first man into orbit in 1961 to the surface of the moon in just 8 years. During this 8-year period, the so-called space race between the US and the USSR was a transfer of the Cold War into orbit. Since they could not fight each other with weapons, regardless of whether they were fighting by proxy on half the planet, the two superpowers set out to prove their superiority by conquering space. The moon was the obvious target, and the timetable was set in September 1962 by President John F. Kennedy himself, when in a historic speech he stated that no nation that aspires to be the leader of other nations can be left behind in the space race. We decided to go to the moon before the end of the decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. At NASA, they must not have heard this news, and with great joy, while they believed that they could indeed in time send people to the moon, the inflexible deadline made things difficult. At the time, the American space program was indeed behind. The Soviets had launched the first artificial satellite in 1957 and sent the first man into orbit in 1961, shortly after sending the first woman into space in 1963. But these events, along with the presidential speech, essentially gave a blank check to NASA to do everything possible for the US to win, and they succeeded. 6 manned missions have landed on the moon and 12 people have walked on its surface, although Neil Armstrong's first steps were a world historical event. The next ones who stepped there have a hard time being remembered even by Americans themselves. And the mission of Apollo 13 in 1970 would hardly have been heard of if it had not happened for the accident that almost ended in tragedy. The USSR did not even bother to send their cosmonauts to our satellite, the moon. Although they had the technology, they decided there was no point in coming second, and so no Soviet ever set foot there. An expensive mistress? Why did we stop going to the moon? The obvious reason is the huge cost. In the 1960s, NASA absorbed 4 to 5% of the US federal budget. If the same thing happened today, we would be talking about a budget of $140 billion instead of the $16.7 billion it had in 2014. After 1970 and after the goal had been reached, President Nixon decided definitively that the space race was over. It had a winner, and that was not NASA but the USA. So he dramatically cut its funds, changed the priorities of the state. The war in Vietnam was still going on at the time, and forced NASA to limit itself to its earthly home. At that time, in fact, the USSR had already launched its first space station, Salyut 7, and seemed to control near-Earth space. According to NASA itself, the cessation of manned flights to the moon is due to budget costs, cuts, and the change in goals to the joint Apollo-Soyuz flights with the USSR, the American space station Skylab, the development of the space shuttle, and finally of the International Space Station, the ISS. Like a man who gets the woman he's always wanted and who immediately turns his back on her but continues to send her gifts, man stopped working on the moon almost immediately but has continued to send robotic research spacecraft almost non-stop to this day. Vehicles from the USSR and Russia, Japan and European Space Agency, China and India have reached its surface. George Bush Jr. had approved the Constellation program with the goal of returning to the moon in 2020, but Obama's 2011 cuts effectively canceled it. Most experts agree that our interests should be focused beyond our solar system. Transporting humans into space is unimaginably expensive compared to automated vehicles, and it does not really make sense since robots can do everything now. We went to the moon, we explored it. There is no reason to continue Buzz Aldrin, the second man to step on the moon, in the same mission as Neil Armstrong. The goal should not be spectacular successes, but long-term investments. The new space race, JFK's dictum that nation leaders should have leadership in space still has followers, most fanatically in China. In its quest to become a regular global superpower, it plans to send humans to the moon after 2025. A similar program is being pursued by the European Space Agency ESA and US with its EM2 program, while private company Space Adventures Limited has announced it will send tourists to the moon with a ticket price of $100 million and a first launch, it never happened. Now the big target, however, is the planet Mars. Why spend money and resources of any kind on a goal that has been conquered, the moon that is, and not on another that will be a global achievement? Today's technology for a trip to Mars is much more advanced than the technology of the 1960s for a trip to the moon. The Apollo series almost always had a minor or major malfunction, but here too the cost comes into play in relation with the expected result. Man on Mars would be a first-rate communication event, but from a specific point of view, it would not be worth the money. However, President Obama himself has supported the mission program to Mars and stated that man will set foot there around 2035. Aliens and the moon landing, that did not happen? Of course, there are those who think that all this is irrelevant since man never went to the moon and that all the film scenes and photos were taken in a secret NASA studio. Experts are analyzing the shadows and details in an attempt to prove that the US sold a fairy tale, despite images taken by later missions showing the objects left on its surface. There are those who do not dispute the moon landing, but have another theory about what stopped the missions: beings from other planets or its inhabitants themselves presented themselves to the astronauts and ordered them to leave the moon alone. That humanity stopped manned missions shows that we took the warning seriously, but not exactly. Robotic spaceships are still landing on the moon, and no one is breaking them for us or throwing them back into space, unless there is some secret deal with the aliens. And this I've translated from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.